Suzuki is entering an all-new category with one of the most beloved engines in motorcycling and a lot more tech than we're used to seeing from this company. But is the GSX-S1000GX Plus worth the price of admission? Now, what is this motorcycle? To Suzuki, this is a crossover motorcycle, so it is something in between their GSX-S1000 GT and their more adventure-y V-Strom models. This is an on-road motorcycle, but it's gonna have that sport performance mixed with a little bit of that comfort that you get from an adventure bike. This bike is going to compete with bikes like the Yamaha Tracer 9 GT. You might even think of the MV Agusta Turismo Veloce, the BMW S1000 XR, and of course the Versys 1000. Now, Plus is the model that we are getting in the United States. It is basically going to be a GX model with side bags and a center stand. Now, how does this bike compare to the GT Plus? We mentioned that the biggest thing is in that ergonomics. Now, this bike, the handlebar is about 2 inches closer to the rider and about 1.5 inches taller. That's going to open up the rider triangle and make this bike a lot more comfortable for longer distance riding. Other changes related to ergonomics, you've got an all-new seat. It's about 15 millimeters taller, gonna give you a little bit more legroom as well. Now, while ergonomics are a big talking point for a bike like this, the headline here is the electronics. This is actually the most advanced motorcycle that Suzuki has ever built, and they're really proud of what they have done. Is it groundbreaking? No, not necessarily. I think a lot of the technology that we're going to get into is stuff that we're seeing elsewhere in motorcycling from other manufacturers. But for Suzuki to introduce some of the technology here, it is big, and they've done some nice things in the programming that they're really proud of. So first things first, this bike does have a 6-axis IMU. So a lot of the electronic systems are going to use that IMU for cornering data. So this bike is going to have essentially a cornering ABS, lift control, so a wheelie control function built into the traction control. Now that traction control, it kind of has almost 2 parts to it. Suzuki calls it roll torque control. So as the bike is leaned over, it's deciding how much power it can deliver to the bike before the rear wheel would step out. In addition to that, now it does also still have a TC system where the power is going to get cut so once the rear wheel starts sliding. The big thing here that Suzuki is really proud of, and a first for them, is the electronic suspension. Now, this is the first electronic suspension from Suzuki. It's a very similar system to what Kawasaki is using for the Versys 1000. It's a Showa system, but with programming direct from Suzuki and input from them. So they've got us today on roads that really vary in terms of conditions. You've got cobblestone, really smooth asphalt, broken up stuff, highways, and they're just trying to prove that this bike has a little extra versatility over even the GT model that came before it. Now, similar to the Suzuki models before, this bike has 3 ride modes, an A, B, and C. Those systems are gonna have pre-programmed settings for traction control, for the suspension, but you can go in and fine tune your selection individually and kind of build out those modes however you want. A is obviously gonna be the more aggressive. The initial settings are gonna be a little bit tamer for the traction control, and your suspension settings are gonna be stiffer. Now, if you go to the other end of the spectrum to C, you're gonna have a little bit more aggressive traction control settings and softer suspension. You can build a custom user mode for the suspension that allows you to kind of fine tune the suspension settings, give you a little bit extra tunability there. Then on the rear, they have electronically adjustable preload, which is going to affect the suspension when it recognizes that someone has either sat on the bike, you've put extra gear on the bike, or the passenger has got off the bike. One of the big things that Suzuki is doing is pulling a lot more data from this bike. So you've got stroke sensors, and it's kind of just managing all of that data and telling this bike how to perform. Again, just a lot more features and technology and overall refinement compared to the GT model that came before it. As for that engine, this is a variant of that K5 GSX-R 1000 that's been talked about for years. This is an 18-year-old engine at this point. There's a reason why Suzuki is still using this in its platforms, because it is so good. Of course, it has over the years been massaged for on-road kind of performance. It's got a little bit more mid-range than what you would have had in the GSX-R 1000 back in the day. Suzuki claims about 150 horsepower. We have dyno tested a GT model just a year or 2 back. It made about 135 horsepower on our dyno, so that's about what you can expect in the real world at that rear tire. A couple more things from a chassis perspective. The subframe is going to be a little bit stiffer and longer compared to the GT models. They're expecting this thing to be loaded down just a little bit more. Looking at just a few other miscellaneous bits on the new GX model, you've got Brembo brake calipers on this thing. You've got a adjustable windscreen on it. I do the air quotes because there are 3 positions for that windscreen, but it's actually Allen key and then reposition the windscreen. So kind of a miss in our opinion there. It's not just a clasp type system where you can run the windscreen up or down. It does have the same 6.5-inch TFT display that was available on the GT models. The programming is just a little bit different so that you can manipulate the new electronic systems. All of the other switchgear and things like that are as you have found them on the GT. Now, what is this thing like to ride? Now, I'm gonna go right through to the engine because it's the quickest thing to get to, right? Because it's great. It's an incredibly capable engine. I think that it feels a little bit almost rough around the edges compared to some of the newer platforms, but I think that's what gives this bike a little bit of character. Really great fueling on this motorcycle, tons of low-end mid-range torque, plenty of roll-on power there. It's such a great platform for street riding and plenty of power up top. This bike is happy to do wheelies, play around all day long. Handling isn't as light as I would like it to be on this bike. It still feels a little bit heavy, and that's where you kind of feel some of this outdated hardware coming in. I wish the bike handled a little bit lighter. If Suzuki was to build an all-new chassis to re-engineer this whole platform, I think they could make something that's a little bit lighter, a little bit more nimble. They're claiming about 511 pounds without the bags, which is a little bit more than your Tracer 9 GT. It's, say, lighter than the MV still, so weight is right about there, but I still think that they could make this thing handle just a little bit lighter and be a little bit more nimble. Now, what I will say, and what I think has been true of so many Suzuki models before this, is that it is incredibly stable and planted. It's just a really enjoyable motorcycle to ride. That's a little bit from the engine, it's a little bit from the chassis. It's just so user-friendly. It's what we have come to expect from Suzuki. Now, that is all to say that this bike is so similar to the GT models before it, but in a lot of ways it is different, and it all goes back to those new electronics. We got to talk to the Suzuki engineers today. They're so proud of this system, and I think rightfully so. Again, it's not the newest stuff in all of motorcycling, right? We've seen electronic suspension from so many different manufacturers at this point, all of the IMU-based stuff. They took a lot of pride in building out the systems to their spec, to what they wanted the bike to do. And that really does make a difference in this GX model. It makes it so much more versatile. And that really was the big takeaway from my experience today with the GX model. And I think that's the thing that Suzuki is doing so well right now, is refining these electronics that they have. The cruise control is seamless. Getting that thing activated, adjusting your speed, all the switch gear is just exactly where you want it. The electronics on this bike are the standout. Now, that is not to say that this bike is perfect. Again, I mentioned some of the little things that we wish Suzuki had done, like introducing an adjustable windscreen on this thing.
I'll also say that while I appreciate the added versatility that comes from the electronic suspension, I was never able to get comfortable with the automatic preload adjustment out back. I just felt like it made the bike feel busy, and ultimately I always went back to the fixed settings.
No heated grip standard. And then there's little things like the brakes. They're just not quite as performance oriented as some of the stuff we're seeing elsewhere in the category. Another thing that kind of stood out to us, the side bags, they are 25 liters each, and they are just big enough to fit a size medium full face helmet in. The biggest thing for me though is the price tag on this motorcycle. It is $18,500 in the States, and it only comes in a matte green. That's a lot of money when you consider that the Yamaha Tracer 9 GT is almost $2,000 cheaper. Now, of course, that is a triple. It is a little bit smaller engine, but that thing is exciting. It's got character, and I think that is one of the bikes that people are going to be cross-shopping here. So who is this bike for, and what does it offer? Well, I think it is for the person who's going to be doing a little bit more longer distance riding. I think this is so much more versatile than the GT or GT Plus models. If you are interested in that kind of K5 based platform, you're a Suzuki fan, you've been looking for a GSX-S, 1000 model, this is probably one of my favorite GSX-S models so far. Thank you for tuning in to our review of the GSX-S1000GX Plus. If you like what you're seeing, be sure to hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. If you've got any questions about the new bike, throw a comment below, give us some feedback. We love hearing from you. Thanks so much. We'll see you in the next one.